Hello there. And as predictably as ever, out come the calls to tax Shell into the ground. Now that the accounts are in, we can see that Shell made a whopping $9.8 billion in the final quarter of 2022, and that took the annual profits to $39.87 billion US, and that's nearly double that achieved in 2021. And everyone's angry, of course, with many ranting about basically taxing Shell into extinction. And there's lefty commentary everywhere telling us how all this money should be ripped out of the company and distributed about the UK for all manner of things. The left, as ever, demanding that if it moves, tax it, and if it doesn't, give it benefits. All, of course, forgetting that these are global profits that attract taxation in foreign countries, not in the UK. And any windfall taxes payable in the UK can be offset to allow the company to invest the dosh in UK energy security. Now, Shell has so far paid no windfall taxes, but has said it expects to pay out nearly $2 billion in windfall taxes to the UK and the EU for the final quarter's profits. And with the high UK and EU windfall tax rates, one assumes that the company's profits in the UK and EU combined were just a bit more than that $2 billion. UK and Norway, for example, both imposed taxes of about 75%, remember. Now Labour is accusing the company of reaping the windfalls of war. What are they meant to do? Give it away? Now, global politics determines how these markets work, and Shell is as much at their mercy as anyone. But while Labour points fingers, they told the World Economic Forum recently that they would be clipping the wings of North Sea oil and gas operators once they get into power. Something that will drive oil and gas companies out of UK waters, resulting in even higher prices for UK consumers. But we'll have all those extra useless solar panels and wind turbines, won't we? Right now, I reckon energy companies would prefer to invest in just about any other country than the UK. Also, our politicians can polish their green halos while paying extortionately to export our carbon footprint at great cost to ourselves. The real issue here is that these obscene profits are a clear indicator that oil and gas are necessities, not luxuries. They are necessary for both business and the wider community to function as a modern economy. Without them, we would be back in the pre-industrial age. And if renewables were the answer, we'd already be using them. Our government is allowing the eco-loons to drive our energy agenda, driving us away from coal, oil, gas and nuclear. And that's why we have so little energy security and why prices are so high. So the Bank of England put the bank rate up to 4%, to what would have historically been regarded as at the lower end of average rates. And people start bleating as if it was somehow a record. It may be the highest in 14 years, but before 2008 it was averaging at about 5, maybe 6%. And in the 70s and 80s it was about 10%. But over the last 14 years, many have got used to what is actually obscenely cheap costs of borrowing. And this leads people and governments to overstretch and help prices of things like houses to reach ridiculous heights. And people will struggle if they have overborrowed, believing that extremely low interest rates are the norm. So this is one reset we do need, just to get the UK economy back onto a normal footing. Now, speaking on GB News today, Liam Halligan, their economics expert, said that he expects one more rate hike of 0.25% in the spring. Then, with inflation under control, rates might come down a bit later in the year. while the Bank of England has dialed back on its previous doom and gloom, saying it expects a shorter, shallower recession than previously predicted. But rate hikes also impact on consumer spending and therefore on company performance and profits, as well as making it more expensive for companies to borrow and invest in improvements for the future. So that will also act as a drag. And then there's the large pay rise demands that will be coming in too. Oh, and you may not have heard, but the European Central Bank, the ECB, has also put their rates up by 0.5%. But it has also already signalled that they will probably be forced to do the same again at their next decision point. And that is because, shock horror, the Eurozone and the wider EU have as big a problem with inflation as Brexit UK has. However, it would be good to see UK taxes reduced to more comfortable levels. But the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has ruled that one out, despite the government getting a tax windfall of its own of 12 billion quid last year. The Chancellor said, "Inflation is a stealth tax that is the biggest threat to living standards in a generation, so we support the bank's action today, so we succeed in halving inflation this year." And he said the government and bank will work in lockstep to get inflation down. Sounds like he's looking to rip the plaster off rather than prolonging the agony. But I reckon this will take the better part of a year, and the Tories don't now have the better part of a year to turn their chances around. And now over to Richard.
Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, was a strange little island, and everyone on that island was living in servitude. Yet they did nothing about it. The majority of the people spent most of their incomes paying for either their rents or their mortgages. But that was how things were done there on this strange little island. Then, one day, a brave chap stood up and said, "This is silly." And the people all knew it was silly. Yet the people who benefited the most from the house servitude worked for a sacred organisation called the bank. And these banks wanted to keep the silliness going. You see, the banks printed money out of thin air in what they called loans that were never really loans, then charged people for the money they pretended to lend them. And the people didn't care, because they couldn't care. Why else did they do nothing? When the people were unable to pay their mortgages or rents because the system was rigged by the banks to protect the banks, the people let the banks take possession of their homes. They didn't all stand up for some reason together and say, "No more," or get their friends around to prevent eviction and keep the bailiffs at bay. No, they rolled over, and the banks then took their homes and then sold them on to the next person, who may then go through exactly the same cycle. And the people still said, "My home is my castle." And oh, how the banks laughed at them, knowing the little people of this island would do nothing to shatter the status quo. And the banks lived happily ever after. The end.